Today was not the day for teddy bears picnics, but for fanatics. At the Ashes, the Just Stop Oil Brigade momentarily stopped play. The hero of the hour was Johnny Bairstow, who removed one protester and dropped him over the boundary rope as you might send rubbish down a waste disposal chute. Have a look. The cheer from the crowd was, I think, well-deserved. But the Just Stop Oil Brigade aren't the only fanatics. The Climate Change Committee, published its report today. It wants to make us cold and poor urgently. The committee has not noticed that our efforts to reduce carbon dioxide have already been successful. We've done so much more than other wealthy nations. But they're constantly undermined by China, which produces emissions faster than we reduce them. We are damaging our own economy with the third highest energy prices, making British industry less competitive. We're also increasing our emissions by not exploring our own gas and oil reserves in the North Sea and indeed through fracking. What we're doing is making people poorer, and this will get worse through the ban on gas boilers in new builds by 2025. And no one else is following our ban on new petrol and diesel cars in 2030. Even the EU, which we left because it was such a regulatory mess, has delayed it to 2035. And we get confusing messages. We keep on being told one thing and then it changes. Who now remembers that we were told we ought to have diesel cars? The great diesel scandal that started in 2001 in the interest of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. In 2001, the Labour Chancellor, Gordon Brown, changed the tax system, intending to protect the environment by encouraging the purchase of diesel cars. But now they're saying that diesel cars should pay ULEZ charges, and the same's happening with hybrids. They used to be the panacea, but today's papers reported that hybrids should be phased out for whatever reason. The reason is the Greens have changed their mind. The government institutions have got so much wrong on this, and as they've got it wrong before, how should we trust them now? I don't want to be cold and poor, and I assume you don't either. But I always want to know what you think. Mailmog at gbnews.com. But as we're a channel that's in favour of free speech, I'm delighted to be joined by Just Stop Oil supporter Dr. Kushnekar, who I hope may try and defend the ridiculous behaviour at Lord's today. What possible service did that provide to anybody?
Well, Jacob, you just described the Independent Climate Change Committee as fanatical, and you described Just Stop Oil as fanatical. What is fanatical about wanting a livable future? What is fanatical about saying that we need to end new oil and gas? That is the exact same thing that is being said by the United Nations, by the International Energy Agency, by the IPCC. You seem to be one of the only people who seems to think that we need new oil and gas.
We're going to have new oil and gas.
I wonder why that might be.
We're going to have new oil and gas, whether it comes from the UK or it comes from Saudi Arabia and Russia. You want to make the Saudis and the Russians rich.
No, literally in today's Climate Change Committee report, it says that we will need oil and gas for years to come until we get to net zero. But that does not justify new oil development.
And we should have our own source resources. I'm saying that we need to
reduce the amount of oil and gas that we're using so that we can use the oil and gas that we've got.
We should use our own supplies. But what were your fanatical What were your fanatical friends at the cricket doing this morning? What possible benefit did that have? That just makes you look like Looney Tunes, doesn't it?
Well, it's got me talking on this programme today.
Yeah, but it hasn't won you any support. You were roundly booed at Lord's, and Johnny Bairstow, who dropped that hooligan over the boundary, was widely cheered.
Well, would you like to talk about how important action on the climate crisis is? Because that's what I'm here to talk about.
We're delighted that you're here, but what I'm saying is that we can't just wish the end without practical means, and we can't get to the end by making people cold and poor.
My job is to protect the health of my patients and the health of the population.
Well, I hope you're not going on strike, which most of the doctors seem to be doing.
We know that new oil and gas is the biggest threat to health that we are going to see in our lifetimes.
But you've just contradicted yourself, because a moment ago you accepted we were going to need oil and gas for many decades to come. Where's that coming from if we're not allowed to get new oil and gas? We need the supplies. That's part of the transition.
No, we need to reduce demand. We need to reduce our dependence and our addiction on fossil fuels.
But we might as well have a domestic supply as a foreign supply. That's good for the British economy. It actually reduces emissions because it doesn't have to be transported.
We need to stop the supply of oil and gas. while we transition to a just
Well, a moment ago,
future
you said you wanted to
based on
reduce the
renewables.
demand.
We need to rely on wind, on solar, on
Yeah, but
hydro.
we haven't got there yet. And when the wind doesn't blow, do you want our lights to go out?
Jacob, how much money have you got invested in oil and gas?
Me, I don't have any money invested in oil and gas. Your cheap tricks to try and assume people are talking their own books just wrong. So
Do you not,
that was a mistake. That was almost as silly as your protest
money
at
invested in
Lord's.
oil and gas that you take dividends from, including Russian gas companies?
I don't take any dividends from Russian gas companies. That's just a lie. So you want to come on here and tell lies. Why don't you stick to the facts?
It was widely reported that Somerset Capital has got money in Russian gas companies that you took £600,000 in dividends from.
Just because things are reported doesn't make them true. And Somerset Capital does not invest its own money. It has clients. So I don't have any money in Russian oil and gas. That was a lie. Very nice to have you. Continue your foolish protests because you make the argument for net zero worse. Your fanatics do real damage to a case that has some logic behind it in other areas. But I'm very pleased to have William Sitwell with me today, because, William, you were at Lord's today. You saw the protest. You saw the cheer that Johnny Bairstow got when he dropped the protester over the boundary. Actually, they do themselves more harm than good, don't they, by behaving in this way?
Yeah, and I was at the cricket with you, funnily enough.
Right.
It was quite a useful moment because it stirred us from catching up and, reading the paper and just having a cup of coffee. And it's become a rather affectionate moment in national life. You know, they have the national anthem, and if you're at the cricket or if you're at the snooker, Just Stop Oil parade, do their parade with their orange dust, and it rather lit up the ground. People were a bit sort of snoozy at the beginning of a day at Lord's. But I'm afraid, your guest is right. I mean, we're now talking about it. They're trying to, by carrying out what you call foolish stunts, they end up on the news discussing their serious points. And I suppose that these protesters would always say, if you've got to run in front of a horse or make a fool of yourself to be able to make people think about a particular issue. I mean, they're not going to convince the white middle-class male-dominated audience at Lord's, but they will be on the front pages of the newspapers.
They'll be on the front page, but actually I don't think they make the argument for net zero come faster, because they make people think that all the people arguing for this are strange people who throw paint. And there are some quite serious people involved in this argument, some serious scientists. And the aim of net zero is not in itself a bad one, but they undermine the credibility, I think, of the whole academic argument for net zero by their fanaticism.
Yeah, because people just think they're pests.
That's right.
If they stop people going to work, if they stop people enjoying a national pastime.
And it's not just the cricket audience, because they've been doing it, stopping children getting to school, stopping people getting to hospital appointments, even people who've been very ill not getting to hospital. And I think that undermines the whole green agenda.
I mean, what it did was stir the crowd into a sort of patriotic fervour. You know, when Johnny Bairstow picked him up, carried him across the pitch, it was really moving.
Because he carried him quite a long way.
Yeah, it was quite strong.
50 yards or something.
Absolutely, and the crowd were really behind him. And then he went off, I think, probably to get some of the orange dust off his pads or something, and he got the most enormous roar on the way back. But as I say, it's not about the audience at Lord's, it's about getting on the news.
But you've been very interesting, your expertise is as a food critic, on food and net zero, and people have been saying you should eat less meat and you should be vegan and so on. But you'd contest that, wouldn't you? You think that veganism is not a route to net zero?
Well, I think we're going to probably talk about this in due course, but I do agree. I mean, I also think that I completely respect people's lifestyle choices, but I think it's very difficult to cope with people forcing their viewpoints on you. And I think there's a lot of problems with vegan lifestyles in terms of health and in terms of their claims about climate change. Because, of course, monogamous monoculture that you create in terms of crops like soybeans and so on are responsible for depleting rainforests, etc., etc. So there are a lot of worrying aspects of the climate debate when it comes to a strictly vegan diet. But my view is, I think the more variety in a diet, the better. And you should never have a sort of monogrammed single thing that you eat.
But like the protest at the cricket, when you get people making extreme arguments, it opens the way for people who are sceptical about the need for dramatic change to say, well, look, the only people really asking for this are protesters, are paint throwers, and therefore let's just carry on as we are. Let's actually make sure our economy is competitive and efficient. And to that extent, what happened today is actually damaging for the Just Stop Oil people.
I think most people see it as a fringe event that's not about them and their lives, that's a sort of comedy element that they see everywhere. And you see it across social media, and it antagonises people. But as you suggest, I don't think it tackles any of the arguments. What it does is it irritates people and it upsets people. People have paid quite a lot of money to have a nice, peaceful day at the cricket. I mean, it disrupted it for about 3 minutes.
It didn't last very long. Actually, the slow over rate can't be blamed on the protest, and the slow over rate is another discussion. And the ground staff got rid of them very quickly, and indeed the teams, the Australians as well, got rid of one of the other protesters. So it was a pretty efficient effort to clear the pitch up.
We were cheering on the guy with his gigantic hoover.
That's right. The ground staff came on with a vast hoover, and the paint was soon cleared up.
It was very impressive. And I think, obviously, they wanted to get onto the actual wicket. And I don't think they expected the team members to actually be the first line of defence. I think they felt that the cricketers themselves would probably allow them to get to the crease, but they didn't. And what Bairstow did was an act of, great heroism. It really was. It was good to see, because no one knows how they behave in a moment of crisis. And now we know that when stuff hits the fan, Bairstow's our man. There he is.
For the last test, everyone was talking about whether Bairstow was taking all the catches. Now they're talking about him catching protesters. So he got a very key catch today.